Back. I appreciate it. We are going to go through very quickly the end of the financial management and get into allowable cost. We talked quite a bit yesterday about internal controls and that information. So let's go ahead and just jump in here. Again, if you have questions, please either chat or unmute yourself. Feel free to interrupt me and ask the question. I'm fine with it. The point is for you to get the answers you need. So first thing I want to talk about, auditors have to report the following findings. Okay, there's no leeway on this. Significant deficiencies, material weaknesses, and internal control. Significant instances, material non-compliance with the provisions of federal grants regulations. Any question costs greater than $25,000. Known or likely fraud. And they are also required to report on prior audit findings and where you are in your corrective action plan. As we discussed yesterday, you as the tribe are responsible for developing a corrective action plan to address any reported findings. Then the next year, your auditors will follow up. So as part of your compliance monitoring, you need to stay on top of that and see, have we done what we said we were going to do? Okay, questions, comments, anything? There we go. Documentation. Best practice is separate files for every grant. A lot of people like to do color-coded. Each funding agency has its own color. That's fine, whatever works for you. You can have electronic copies as long as they're accessible. The one thing you need to remember is when your auditors come in, they're going to ask you to give them paper. That's true with most monitoring from funding agencies as well. That's fine. Whatever they want is fine. Got to protect it. All these records from theft, fire, water damage. Most people use a fireproof file cabinet that locks. Love that. It's not horribly expensive and it's certainly very effective. Files should always contain a copy of the award letter, the assistance agreement, the grants management calendar and tracking chart. What do you have to submit? When do you have to submit it? You know, what are your checkpoints here as far as spending and effective management? All of those things should be thought about in advance and set up some kind of calendar reporting tickler file. Is what we used to call it in the olden days. Whatever works to make sure that everybody knows this has to be done. You'll always want to include your work plan, your budget detail, any notes and communications from your funding agency. My computer is not cooperating. Okay, because you are again required to maintain records that identify adequately sourced use of funds. These are all the things you have to track. How long do you have to keep it? Financial program records must be maintained for 3 years from the date of submission of the final expenditure report or from the date of the submission of the annual financial report for grants that renew automatically. What is that telling you? When you file your final SF 425 or other narrative, whichever is later, that's when your 3-year clock starts, okay? You have to keep the information. If there is an audit that was started before the 3-year period expired, or litigation or anything like that, you have to keep that information until final action is taken. So the standard is 3 years. Now, how many of you have far more than 3 years on hand? Be honest. Yeah, most people have a lot of information. This is not necessarily to your advantage, because if you have it on hand, your auditors, your monitors can continue to go back, and you're in violation of your own record retention policy. So make sure you have a policy that specifically states this information here in 200-333, and then follow it. Don't have 40 years of old checks. You don't need them. Okay, again, you need a policy. Method to transfer certain records to the federal agency if required. Method for collection, transmission, storage of information. Access to records. This is huge. Who has access? Federal agency and anybody who is acting on their behalf, which includes your auditors. These records are not public information. Why not? What did we discuss yesterday? Protected personally identifiable information. Good job. Yeah. It is not public information who has been assisted by any program or who has applied. Yeah, you don't disclose information on protected personally identifiable information, period. Questions on that? Can you have public access for financial reports? Absolutely. Here's how much grant money we received, and here's how much was expended. That's included in your audit. That's public. Who received the funding? That's the part that's not public. Okay, any questions on that? Because it is important to understand the distinction. Things that should be kept: bank reconciliations, journal entry files, financial statements, general grant information, award letters, the actual grant itself, any correspondence, all of that should be kept. Vendor files, tenant or other participant files. You have to prove people were eligible to participate. Personnel files need to be maintained. Application general information. Anything that, again, is protected, particularly health-related information and payroll information. Why would we have a separate payroll file? As we talked about yesterday, HR is going to be in and out of that payroll. Auditors will be involved in the payroll. Health-related information, segregation of duties. We always love that. Health-related information, that file too, I can't see why anybody would need to be in that. There may be instances, but I'm not coming up with any off the top of my head. Payroll information should have deductions. Any deductions that the employee has authorized. If there are other withholdings required, child support, back tax, that type of thing, that may also be in the payroll. Any questions on that? Again, the key is you have to keep it, and you have to keep it for 3 years from the last report. Source documents. Accounting records, journal entries, financial records have to be supported by source documentation. What are examples of source documentation? PO, receipt, checks, receiving reports, any kind of invoice. All of those are considered source documents. They support the information that is being shown. We can physically look at a total amount, such as cash, and go back and see, where did this cash come from? How has it been used? Is this amount correct? Same with all of your expenditures. You can physically go back and pull the detail and see what was purchased, from who, when, who approved it. If you don't have source documents, probably looking at an unallowable cost, because you have to be able to prove that it was spent in a way that was authorized through the award. Questions on that? Okay, you may need other specific files, applications, certifications, initial award, amendment documents, any change in scope, budget, mod, anything like that. You'll need to keep your financial status reports, your general ledgers, and your supporting documentation. Anything that is used to prove that the grant was spent in the correct manner needs to be kept. Again, narratives, the budget modification, communication with officials, any partnerships, any progress reports, financial reports, and the closeout reports. Questions on that? Y'all are really quiet. Again, we just talked about this. Source documents basically provide evidence to support the accounting transactions. We didn't discuss time and attendance records, and those are big. We will talk a little bit more about that when we start talking about allowable personnel costs in the next section. But all costs to be allowable have to be supported by accurate records. If I am your auditor and I want to see that this person their time was appropriately charged to grants, I should be able to pull time cards, time sheets, and see it for myself. Okay, here's one I really like. Let's talk about documentation. And you are welcome to use this as a checklist if you want to. Is it reasonable? Would a prudent person consider this reasonable? Is it necessary to perform the grant? You know, do we have to have it to be able to do our job? Is it allowable? Is it allowable within the scope of the proposed project? Do we have a clear business purpose? Is it obvious that we bought this for the grant and not for ourselves? This becomes a bigger issue when you're using credit cards. That documentation, that's where you really need to focus a lot of effort, because credit cards are risky. I'm not saying you can't use them. I'm saying you need to have good controls in place. Was this in our budget? If it's in our budget, has a clear business purpose, and is reasonable and necessary, then it's an allowable cost. Do we have funding available? If we don't have the money, we're not buying it. Is it coded correctly? And again, whose responsibility is it to do the coding? Think all the way back to yesterday. Yeah, your directors. Why the directors? The directors are responsible for the coding because they're the ones who know the budget and what is allowable. They understand what each line item purpose is. Finance is the check on that. They will do the input. They produce the financial reports, which are then reviewed by directors, by staff, by council to verify that this information appears to be correct. Any questions on this? Other things to consider. Has the purchase order check request been approved? Is there a conflict of interest in this purchase? Has it been disclosed? If so, is it allowable under 2 CFR 200? Did we follow our policy and allow adequate time for the paperwork to be processed? Or are we rushing this through at the last minute? I want you to really focus on these next 3. Was policy followed? Every check request, every purchase order should be able to stand on its own as to what we got, where we bought it, why we bought it, when we bought it, and it was an appropriate use of the funds. If it is something unusual, and let's face it, there will be things that are unusual, document it. Do a memo to file and jot down, hey, this is why we did this. Here's who all signed off on it. Here's why it was allowable. This is our support, because 2 years from now, you're not going to remember, guarantee you. What are some things that might fall into that? One of the big ones for this program is going to be justification of contract rates over the prescribed amounts for the DOJ. If you are hiring an attorney and you are paying more than the specified rate in the DOJ agreement, you need to document why. You know, if you're buying certain types of maintenance supplies and materials right now, you're going to see a lot of price variations depending on where you are in the country. Between, as one of my friends is now calling it, between the sick and multiple storms that have caused major cost increases, you need to document, yeah, this is why we paid more. Are you going to remember that there was a giant winter storm 2 years from now and that screwed up getting fuel to different parts of the country? No, you won't. I mean, maybe you will, but I wouldn't want to bet on it. How comfortable are you? If this becomes public that you signed off on this purchase, if your mom is going to read about it in the paper tomorrow, are you going to be okay with it? The answer is no. You might want to document some more. Okay, any questions? Let's get into cost principles. You have to have written procedures to determine allowability of costs in accordance with 2 CFR 200 subpart E and the conditions of the award. So let's talk a little bit about cost. There is not a universal rule for determining that a cost is always a direct cost or an indirect cost. Always depends on the program, what you're doing, what your responsibilities are under the award. You are required to be consistent. If it is utilities cost for this program that is part of your indirect, it should be utilities cost across the board. If your grant is to fund utility costs, such as LIHEAP, that's a direct cost. Is everybody clear on how that's going to be different? This is important for you to understand. Yes, no, kind of. Linda's got it. Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on, but I'm not convinced. If you have questions, please ask them. Okay, your responsibilities in spending federal awards. Efficient and effective administration, sound management practice. Where do we get that information? What helps us determine efficient and effective administration? Your policies and procedures. That's also the information you need to ensure that you are administering grants in accordance with all the statutes and regulations. Sound organization management. Be consistent. Provide adequate documentation to support the costs charged to the award. This one is critical in explaining the difference between, corporate accounting versus government accounting. In government accounting, we're not set up to earn a profit. We are set up to provide services. You don't get a bonus for not spending your money. Okay, you've justified you need this money. Now it's your responsibility to spend it in the manner you said you would. Your whole job is to provide service. Does that make sense? That's what makes government accounting special right there. You aren't winning if you have money left over. Okay, factors affecting allowability of costs. It must, I don't know why that happened. Let's try that again. I wasn't even touching anything. That was strange. Okay, it must be necessary, must be reasonable, must be directly allocable to the grant. Needs to conform to the grant award purpose. What are we supposed to be doing? When I look at this cost, does this support our grant objective? Has to be consistent with your policies and procedures. Again, has to be accorded consistent treatment across the board. Should be GAAP, which I'm not going to get into since most of you are not accountants. Should not be used as a cost sharing or a matching fund. So the money you receive under this grant cannot be used to match another grant unless you have specific written approval from your funding agency, period. Does that make sense? Okay, reasonable. Does not exceed the amount that would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances at the time the decision was made. And necessary is it's needed to perform the grant requirements. So let's talk about a vehicle. We talked a little bit yesterday. We decided we could buy a Ford F-150, would we say brand new, roughly 55,000. Is that reasonable? You tell me, is it reasonable? Why is it reasonable? Somebody besides Linda, tell me why this amount is reasonable. She's already jumped in and given you the answer. It's the standard pricing. How do you know it's the standard pricing in your area? Because you've done the research. You have looked around, probably on the internet, and gotten some basic pricing before you even went out for bid to determine what is a reasonable price for this vehicle. Your 3 bids confirm it, but you develop that pricing before you ever go out for bid. We know that we could have bought it for a lot less last year. Would we need documentation to show why we're paying more now? Possibly. Has anybody bought a new car in the last 6 months? Either personally or business? Okay, yeah. How much negotiation is there right now? Not a lot. There's not a lot of room to maneuver. You know, a year ago, they were begging you to take the vehicles. Now, it's just, you're going to pay pretty close to sticker right now. That's just a fact. So how do we know that's reasonable? Because we've done our homework and we have documented that this is what's happening. Is it necessary? Well, yeah, because we said in our budget we needed this. In your case, it's probably a passenger van or other method of transporting people. You put it in your budget and said, this is why we need it. You received funding to show this is necessary for you to complete your budget, to complete your grant. What things might be questionable under the necessary? How about travel? If you were to attend a conference right now, assuming you could, would you need to justify that why that was necessary for you to attend in order to perform the grant requirements? The answer is yes, you would. Why should I pay you to fly to Las Vegas for a conference? What's in it? How is this going to make you better? Make sense? Okay, allocable means it is chargeable or assignable directly to a federal award. Okay. If it is incurred specifically for one award, that's easy. Charge it to that grant. If it benefits more than one award and costs can be distributed in proportions that may be approximated using reasonable methods, and the cost is necessary to operation and assignable. What the heck does that mean? Okay, let's talk about payroll. That's a pretty good one. Is everybody you hire only assigned to one grant? Probably not. Can you allocate that person's payroll between the awards that benefit? Yes, you can. If you can't, then you can't do it. I'm trying to think of another good example. This is mostly payroll or supplies. Does anybody have an example they'd like to use as far as allocation that's not an indirect allocation? Everything that benefits from the indirect that is included in your indirect agreement is allocated. Okay, you've got 3 departments sharing one building for electrical. Is that included in your indirect cost proposal? That's my first question. Okay. Then are they having to share any costs that are not included in the indirect? Okay, then there's your allocation plan, is directly to the indirect. And that's why we do the indirect, to make this simple if possible. Are there circumstances where you may not have an indirect cost proposal to show an allocation of space cost? And the answer is yes. If you are running a shelter and everybody in that shelter is supported under one of 2 grants, is it reasonable that those would be direct costs, depending on how your grant is written, and we would divide those costs accordingly? Happens all the time. Has anybody had that happen? Again, emergency housing, shelters, that type of thing, where there is a completely separate building and only, maybe 1 or 2 departments use it and it is all grant supported, may have that situation. If you do, either contact me or contact your financial assistance person and do a walkthrough on how you'll get reimbursed on that. Okay, obviously, you cannot use your grant money to fund another program, including shifting costs. This was, let's go back to the electrical. You have 2 programs who are sharing a shelter, and one program is over budget. You can't just charge all of the utilities cost to the grant that is not over budget. Does that make sense? Because it's not fair. Yeah, when this was set up, costs were to be allocated. And you can't just now go, we overspent on the vehicle, we're out of money, so the other grant can pay for it. You cannot split costs to avoid the regulations and statutes. Questions on that? Okay, if a cost benefits two or more projects in proportions that can be determined without undue effort or cost, you should allocate. Again, two programs sharing a building. 60% of the participants are being funded with one grant, 40% are funded with another grant. Is it pretty simple that way to do an allocation? Yes. What you don't want to do is get to the point where you're trying to break down the costs, like to each person, and then allocate it to the grant based on a single person. Does that make sense? Because you're going to complicate things further. When I have one person in here, it costs us this much. So we have 14 people times this one person, and it's not proportional. Yes, no, maybe so. Okay, if you receive a credit, purchase discount, rebate, explain a little more on the allocation. Okay, I know that this shelter has 40%. I'm trying to think of a good grant to use. We've got 60% of the people in there are eligible under the OVC grant. 40% of the people in the shelter are through, I don't know, let's make it tribal dollars. Is it pretty simple to break down the charges between the two grants? Can we do a 60-40 percentage? Yes. Do we have the documentation to do it? Yes. With payroll, can we do a study that says, or have a timesheet that says, we are going to charge this person 60% to this grant and 40% to tribal based on the timesheet? When you do a timesheet, do you do it by the minute? Do you do it by 15-minute increments, 30-minute increments? How do you do it? "15-minute increments." Okay. Is that reasonable? Yes. Is it reasonable to break it down into 1-minute increments? Would that be more accurate? Yes, it would. But what? That is definitely a lot of effort and cost. Yeah, it's going to take a lot of time and energy. And frankly, from a dollar perspective, is it going to make a difference? Think about you're working the front desk, and every phone call that you take, you have to put to one of three grants. Every time the phone rings, you say, okay, I spent 3 minutes here, spent a minute here, I spent a minute here. Is that reasonable? No. That is significantly, that is a significant amount of effort and cost. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. If it's reasonable, and I would say 15-minute increment is more than reasonable. A 1-minute increment is way more effort and energy than is going to make a difference. Okay, how many of you know that you sometimes get purchase discounts or rebates or something like that? Grants that are buying a lot of supplies are more likely to fall into that. Office Depot, yeah. So when you get a discount, or are you getting a rebate or a discount? Probably a rebate. Are you getting like a $15 gift card or something? If you're buying supplies, maintenance supplies through Lowe's, Home Depot, all of those, there are always purchase discounts and allowances. Yeah. If it's a discount, is this revenue or does it reduce the expense? And it says right here, credits must offset or reduce expenses. This is not revenue for you. This is not program income. This is reducing an expenditure. Same with insurance. If you total the car, somebody hits you, and you're driving the tribal vehicle. Car is totaled. You receive an insurance reimbursement of $45,000. And you buy a new car for $50,000. How much are you going to show that that new car cost? Did we have a $45,000 income and then a $50,000 expense? No. Basically, we had a $5,000 expense. The proceeds offset what it costs. The whole point in paying for the insurance expense that you've already paid for is to offset any loss you have. Make sense? Now, are you going to track it as a fixed asset? Absolutely. But there's another asset that's coming off the books, and it's a thing, but it is not new money is the point. This is not brand new money. This is specifically for the replacement of the vehicle. There's nothing else you can do with it. And hopefully you're going to use it and have it come really close to being the same. So kind of an offset, which would mean you're swapping out the old totaled car for the new car. It's a replacement of. Did I lose you on that, or does that kind of make sense? It's not new money. You've got it. Okay, good. Yeah, this is not brand new money, and you can't just spend it on the program. You have to spend it to replace what was broken. Any questions on that? Okay, let's talk about direct costs. Direct costs can be identified specifically with the grant, directly assigned to grant activities, such as compensation for employees, cost of materials and supplies, administration of programs, acquisition of fixed assets, providing services. All of these things are direct costs. An indirect cost is a cost that is incurred for common or joint purpose that is serving more than one cost objective, such as your finance department. Is your finance department, or let's get maintenance. Can you specifically assign each maintenance person to a particular grant? I mean, you probably could, but again, from a cost perspective, does it make sense? You're all in the same building. You have maintenance performing services for everyone in that building. That's an indirect cost. Everybody is benefiting from this. Does that make sense? Again, can we specifically assign how much time it took them to mop this office? Sure, but is the effort disproportionate to the result? And the answer is yes. Do you get the difference between a direct versus an indirect? Is there only one way to allocate indirect? And the answer is no. There are many different acceptable ways to do it. Some people do space cost, some people do salary cost, some people do a combination thereof. The important thing is that you are consistent, and you are consistent in your allocation, that when you apply your indirect rate, you are consistent across the board, and that you comply with your approved manner. So if it's salary cost, you make sure that you're only applying it to salary. You could have an indirect cost rate that applies to salary and benefits, maybe salary only. These are all acceptable ways to do it. This is why you have to submit your current indirect cost agreement, so that that can be reviewed as part of your reimbursement. Make sense? Okay, nobody's asking. And again, if you don't want to use chat, don't forget you can just unmute yourself too. Okay, again, you can allocate your indirect costs. I don't know anybody who's not doing a negotiated indirect cost rate. When you create your budgets, can you list direct and indirect separately? Yes. Because you should have an assumed indirect rate. So here's what we expect on our direct costs. These direct costs are part of our indirect cost proposal. Therefore, we will apply a 27% indirect cost rate to these activities. Okay, here's the key on this. Negotiated rates must be accepted by all federal awarding agencies except when federal statute or regulations override that. What that is telling you is, depending on the funding agency, indirect reimbursement may be capped. There are many programs that will not allow you to charge more than, let's say, 25% for indirect. If your rate is 28%, what happens? Does that mean that isn't, yeah, you only get 25 from the federal government for that particular amount, which means what to you? It's 28% to do indirect. It's been approved. That 3% just magically going to go away? Got to pay for it with non-grant funds. Does that make sense? You always want to charge your full approved rate. Okay? There's never a good reason to charge less if it's not capped, because those costs still will have to be paid and you will have to use your own dollars to do so. Does that make sense? Your indirect cost rate is always going to be what it is. Yeah, Mandy, go ahead.
Yeah, so I had a question on this. So if we don't have the most current indirect rate, the funds that we've budgeted for indirect, are those funds held until we have the approved rate for the funding cycle years?
Okay, here's my first question. Are you running on an extension?
No.
Or are you waiting to do a get approved on a brand new proposal?
No, like even with the NCI microfund. So when I put in for the funds, we had our most recent indirect rate. It was like 19.96 or something.
Okay.
But it wasn't current. So I got funded. We have a new current or a new rate, but it's still not current. So can we only charge indirect for the years that we have a current rate?
Okay, when's the last current approved rate?
Linda could probably correct me, but I think it's 2019.
2019.
But we're working on the newest one now.
Okay, so we've got a couple of different questions here. Did you get an extension? Because you are allowed to do an extension. Oh, 2021 is going to be approved on Monday. Yeah, just do that.
Oh, okay, okay, cool.
Yeah, if
Good news.
you're seriously within a week, yeah, it's
Okay.
just, and you know, you'll have to adjust your costs when that approved rate hits.
Okay, okay, cool. Great
If,
news. Thank you,
yeah,
Christine.
you are very welcome. Yeah, what you need to consider is how old is our rate and where are we in the process? Because of the pandemic and the delayed audits, a lot of people have requested the 2-year extension on their existing indirect cost rate. Can
I
you
have a
do that?
question.
Yes, you can. Yes.
So going back to the indirect cost rate, so I mean, we had applied and were awarded for 5 years under OVC, and we only sent in our current award,
Mhm. Mhm.
and our current indirect cost rate at that time.
Mhm.
So that is what's going to be charged every single year for that 5 years.
You're going to adjust it as your
Okay.
indirect cost changes.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Sure. Yeah, it is confusing, and indirect is confusing. But as you have updated rates, that's how you charge.
Perfect, thank you.
You are very welcome. Anybody else have a question on that? You will have an option to do a 3-year indirect cost rate. Is that a good idea? That depends. Do you expect the number of grants you're running and the amount of indirect cost that will be incurred to be relatively stable over the next 3 years? Maybe. Honestly, if I had a shot at doing a 3-year rate and I did not expect to add a bunch of grants over the next 3-year period, which could potentially increase my base, I would probably take that. If I'm expecting things to stay relatively the same, I would go for that 3-year and just be done with it and move forward. I mean, I don't know how much you all know about doing an indirect cost rate, but you always have to do a reconciliation back to like an audit 2 years ago. You do an indirect reconciliation, and that's where people have gotten really behind because you couldn't get an audit done in the middle of pandemic. What happens if you have a director who will not place indirect cost in their grant? That is an internal issue. I have opinions, but I do not have a regulatory citation on that. We'll say indirect cost is allowed. It is an allowable cost. There is a procedure to develop an indirect cost proposal. And then I'm going to stop talking. These are all great questions. Anybody else have something? Okay, if you've never had an indirect cost rate, you can do a 10% de minimis, but that's if you've never had a rate. Tribe has a current federal negotiated indirect cost rate. You can apply for a one-time extension of the rate for a period up to 4 years. The end of that 4-year period, you have to reapply or negotiate. Again, a lot of people are doing this right now for the reasons I stated, in that getting that reconciliation is kind of rough right now. It's obviously it's becoming a more stable situation as we go forward, but a lot of people do not have a 19 audit complete, which means you can't do a 21 rate until you do. Question on that, comment, anything? Okay, how can you allocate? Any reasonable method. These are examples. I've seen telephone charges allocated based on number of employees. I've seen them based on number of telephones. I see space cost used all the time. How much of our total square footage is taken by this program? That's how we're going to allocate utilities, phone, maintenance, all of those things. Is that an allowable way? Sure. Okay, let's talk about written procedures for the allowability of costs. This is now required under 2 CFR 200, which means you have to have something in your policy that addresses the procedures you take to ensure every cost charged to a grant is allowable. Okay. Procedures have to be reasonable and consistent with what is going to be effective for you to use as a review. What did we decide the most common method would be? We talked about it yesterday. What did we say was the most common? Who remembers back to yesterday? Somebody knowledgeable has to review the expenditures to ensure. Your director. Why is it the director? Did the director write the budget? Develop the plan? Probably. They know the goals and objectives and develop the budget. There you go. If I develop the budget, I know what is allowed in this award. So it doesn't have to be the director. It can be anybody who is knowledgeable of the grant. And you just have a procedure in there in your payment that says prior to paying anything, we verified that this was an allowable cost by having review done by a person knowledgeable of the requirements of the federal award. Make sense? So it can be the director, it can be somebody designated by the director. If you have a separate grant manager, they may do it, could be the tribal administrator. Anybody who understands what that award is for can do this. Okay, this is an interesting change. Audit services. And we're now getting into specific items that are in 2 CFR 200 subpart E, the allowable cost and cost principles. Audit costs are allowable only if the audit is required single audit. Real quick, anybody know the difference between a single audit and an audit? When you say audit, the assumption is that it's a financial audit and there is a financial review to ensure the financial statements are materially correct. With a single audit, you have a financial audit and a compliance audit. The other piece of that audit is to review your compliance procedures and ensure that everything has been performed, it is materially correct. You are meeting the requirements established for your grant. How do you know what those things are? How do you know what you have to do under your grant? Yeah, it's in your award. If you're curious, you can always go to the catalog of federal domestic assistance, and it spells out requirements there. If you have your CFDA number, which we said is that 5-digit number that's on your grant. You can also Google the audit guide. And there's a single audit. Yeah, special conditions usually have all the requirements. Oh yeah. And those are spelled out. So if your total federal awards expended are more than $750,000 for the year, you are required to have a single audit, and those costs are allowable. If you have something other than a single audit, that is not allowable unless you get specific approval. Again, the trigger for that is $750,000 of federal awards expended, not granted, expended. Questions? If you didn't spend $750,000, you didn't get approval, and you had an audit, who's paying for it? The answer is the tribe. Can they do that? Absolutely. That is 100% their decision. You just can't use grant money to do it. And that's true of all of these things when we're talking about allowable versus unallowable. You can always opt to use tribal money. You just can't use grant money. Compensation personal services. Oh, this is always a good one. This is why we have to have timesheets, time cards, some method of showing I was physically present working on this award. Physically present could be I was at my desk at home, I was in the field working with clients. However you want to define that is fine, but you have to have a policy that says, here's what we have to do. Here's how we show we were present. Okay. Now, here's an interesting little twist with this. You have to follow your entity-wide policies and practices concerning extent of professional services that can be provided outside of the entity for non-organizational compensation. What the heck does that mean? I'll simplify for you. The non-federal entity is the tribe. So we're talking about the tribe's policies and practices. They have to be written and they have to explain how much work can you provide outside of the tribe and get paid. Why do they care what you're doing in your off time? Why does that need to be discussed, approved, any of that? What's the point? My first question, in your personnel policy, does it say that you have to disclose other jobs? Why do they make you tell that? Why is it their business? Why is it anybody's business but yours what you do when you're not at work? Because you're being paid with grant money. And if you're paid with grant money, you have to be able to show that you have only performed the work that is appropriate for that grant. So if, and this is a classic example, if I am in the finance department and I am being paid with grant monies, can I have a tax business on the side? Well, I have to ask for I have to notify everybody that I want to do this. Because there is a possibility of me doing my own personal business during business hours when I am being paid with grant money. That's a problem. If I'm being paid with grant money, all of my time is to be used on that grant. Does that make sense? And just so you know, even if you work in corporate, they will still make you, most companies will require you to tell them if any outside employment for the same type reasons. Not because you're being paid with grant money, but because you're being paid with their money and they don't want you doing other business. Okay. I'm going to tell you, just put it in your policy. Have written policies. Does anybody not have a written policy that addresses this? And again, this is most likely in your personnel policy. Yeah, everybody should check and make sure this is addressed. Again, they're saying it's a conflict of interest, and I would agree with that, because how do I know that you are spending all of the appropriate amount of time to do this job and not your outside job? This is a thing and it is a big deal, and be aware of it. Okay, so what kind of compensation is allowable? Can you pay an incentive? And the answer is yes. As long as it's reasonable. Everything is defined prior to the services being rendered. Let's go back to that. So can you do an incentive pay? Yes. But what? We can't say, oh, that was a great idea. Here, have some money. We have to have it in our written policy, agreement, whatever, before we do it. So we say we are going to have a suggestion box for employees. And if you have a suggestion that we use, we'll give you $20. As opposed to, I make a suggestion and they say, that's awesome, here, have $20. That one's not allowable. The assumption is, again, across the board, we have a policy on what we pay people, and it applies whether you are working for grant funds or non-grant funds. We treat you the same across the board. This is really important when we get into some of the travel benefits that are allowed, okay? And employee health and welfare benefits as well. Here's one that's kind of interesting. Did you know that you can use grant money to pay for gym memberships? As long as the entire company, the entire tribe, has that same benefit across the board. You can't pick and choose which grants get it, which programs get it, and which don't. You cannot say that only the people who work in non-grant programs can get those benefits. You cannot say that only those working in programs can get those benefits. Okay, let's talk about salaries and wages, because everybody, this one this one's personal. You should care about this. How do you get paid? Records must be supported by a system of internal controls that provide reasonable assurance that the charges are accurate, allowable, properly allocated. They must be incorporated into the official records of the entity. Must reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated, not exceeding 100%. Include both federally assisted and all other activities compensated by the entity on an integrated basis, but may include the use of subsidiary records as defined in the written policy and comply with the established accounting policies and practices of the entity. Again, time card, time sheets. I know some of you are doing like thumbprint scan, eye scan. There's multiple different ways to do it. Either way, everybody in the organization has to sign in, document their time, submit time records, have those time records approved, and then entered into the payroll system. We do that for everybody, whether they are paid by grant money or not. Same process across the board. Questions? For records which meet the standards required, you won't be required to provide additional support documentation other than what we've already stated, okay? Salary and wage charges for non-exempt employees must also be supported by records indicating the total number of hours worked in a day. Okay, this is why you want to have a policy. You want all of this spelled out. Everybody knows we go to the policy. Okay, does anybody have questions on wage personnel expenses? And this is how you're getting paid. Now would be a good time to ask those questions. Is there an easy way to keep track of an employee's time that is split into 5 different grants? The easiest thing to do is the timesheet and have them monitor and account for their time. You can do a time study and have that approved, but you'll have to go through the timesheet process to get to that. You know, is there an easy way? I mean, timesheets aren't complicated, but I'm not aware of an easier way to do it. Does anybody else have a suggestion? Is anybody doing something other than timesheet or sign in, sign out? Yeah, I'm not really certain there's a simple way to do it because 5 grants is a lot. Okay, any questions about timesheets, time cards, documentation required? We went through internal controls on payroll yesterday. There's a reason you have so many sign-offs, and this is part of it. All of this documentation to support the grant charges, to support the tax charges, payroll tax, all of that. Everything comes back to that timesheet and verifying that the person was physically present and performing the required functions of their job. Okay, compensation, fringe benefits. Overarching criteria here is unless accepted elsewhere in these principles, it is allowable. Fringe benefits are allowable as long as they are reasonable, required by law, or established written policies. Insurance, pension, post-retirement, severance, all of those things are allowable costs, as long as they're part of your policy and reasonable. Leave pay is allowable as long as it is allowable under your written leave policies. You're consistent in how it's treated. Costs are equitably allocated to the related activities and awards. Can I break the leave down to an appropriate grant if I'm working on multiple grants? Here's what you can't do as far as compensation. Insurance on the lives of trustees, officers, or other employees holding positions of similar responsibility are allowable only to the extent that the insurance represents additional compensation. The cost of such insurance when the entity is named as the beneficiary are unallowable. Anybody know what that is? That's basically key person insurance. If you are somebody who has a great deal of institutional knowledge, I, as the tribe, may hold an insurance policy on you so that if something happens, I get money to bring somebody up to speed to basically be your replacement. If you, I don't know, have an airplane fall on your head and you're killed on the way to work, and all of that institutional knowledge goes with you, I have a method of collecting. Can I do this? Yes. Can I do it with grant money? Absolutely not. Has to be tribal. There are also golden parachutes where if you stay for a certain amount of time, then you get a big chunk of money. Again, can I do it? Yes. Can I do it with grant money? No, I cannot. Why can't you do it with grant money? There's a real obvious reason here. Notice that it's trustees, officers. This is basically special compensation to a very limited pool. It doesn't apply to everybody. Therefore, you're not going to be able to do it with grant money. Automobile costs. I love this. Can you provide a vehicle for an employee to use to and from work? Not with grant money. Period. Even if they report this as, taxable income for what they've used for commuting, because commuting's not allowed, driving to and from work. Even so, it's still not allowable with grant money. Now, can you assign somebody a tribal vehicle because they are going to be doing tribal business first thing in the morning, like they're driving straight to a training? Can you do that and have it be okay? And the answer is yes. It's that personal use thing. You cannot give an employee a car to use for their own personal use and charge it to the grant. Ever, ever, ever. Can you do severance pay? Yes, as long as you're consistent. It's part of your agreements. It's in your policy and it's reasonable. Be very careful with doing anything extravagant. Costs incurred in severance pay packages, which are in excess of normal severance, paid to the employee contingent upon a change in control over or ownership of the entity's assets, are unallowable. Can I go back to the insurance cost slide? Didn't completely understand. Yes. Basically, the insurance that is not allowed is something where they're getting a special benefit. You can't pay for it with grant money. Your basic health insurance, the standard life insurance, totally fine. It's when you have a policy on the life of, let's say, and I've seen this quite a bit, the treasurer has a key person insurance and the chief. So if anything happens to them, we collect, we being the tribe, collects on the insurance policy. And that money is to help train and replace them. Because the tribe is the beneficiary and not the employee, it's not allowable with grant money. If it is a special life insurance policy where, because you're special, we're going to make sure if anything happens to you, your family gets $1 million as opposed to our standard 100,000. That's not okay. Now, can it be an option if the employee pays for it? Yes. Cannot charge it to the grant though. It's not a reimbursable grant expenditure. Does that make sense? Good. Yeah, these things are weird. You don't think about it unless it's something you've seen. Again, severance pay, as long as you're consistent and it's reasonable, it's fine. It's when you try to get cute and, if there's a change in ownership or management of the entity, as in if, there's a change in the council, then you're going to get paid a lot more in severance. Not okay. Okay, why don't we take a break before we get into conferences, because there's a lot of twists and turns in conferences. Does anybody have any questions before we pause for, I don't know, you want, let's do 15. That worked nicely yesterday. Okay, it is in my world 42 after the hour. Come back at 57 after the hour. And we'll talk about conferences and all kinds of fun, twisty things. Let me know when you're back and we'll start up again. I have A here. Thank you, Charlotte. Maybe just you and me. All right, Paula's with us now. Lily's here. Sherry's here. Linda's here. All right. Sounds like we've got enough people. Is Joey here?
I'm here.
All right. Let's get going. Anybody have any questions on personnel and fringe benefits? Okay, let's talk about conferences. You've got to exercise discretion on conferences. These are conferences that you are hosting, okay? Why would you host a conference? And I am pulling my reg. Why would you need to host any kind of conference? Outreach, education, training, outreach. Yeah. Can you do it? You can, if what? Contract for services, different, and we'll get into that. A meeting, retreat, seminar, symposium, workshop, or event whose primary purpose is the dissemination of technical information beyond the entity and is necessary and reasonable for successful performance under the award. So yeah, if it says so specifically in your award, you can do it. Things that you cannot pay for are a lot. You have to keep the cost reasonable. And I will tell you right now, you're going to need to get this approved before you do it. You can pay for the basic rental of the facility, speaker fees, cost of meals, refreshment, local transportation, other incidental items unless further restricted by the terms and conditions of the award. Be very cautious if you're doing this and make sure you detail out the costs, particularly on meals, refreshments, local transportation. You are allowed to identify local available dependent care resources, child care, elder care, anything like that. You can't provide it, but you can identify it. The agency may authorize exceptions where appropriate for programs including tribes, children, and the elderly. So theoretically, you may be able to do this under this award, but detail, and have it approved prior. And honestly, this goes across the board for any type of outreach activities that you do across programs. When in doubt, use your tribal money. Okay. This one is fun. Defense and prosecution of criminal and civil proceedings, claims, appeals, and patent infringements. You cannot pursue a claim against the federal government using federal grant funds. The basic legal charges that are required for your administration of your program are allowable. Many of you are providing legal services for participants. That is fine. As long as it is in your award, in your budget, that's fine. What you can't do is use it to defend yourself against outside charges. Does that make sense? And you absolutely cannot use grant money to sue the federal government, period. Entertainment costs. If it has a program purpose and authorized in the approved budget or with prior written approval, you can do it. Here's when this is going to happen and be allowable. How many of your tribes are running like a summer youth program? Got one that is. Imagine probably more of you are. Yeah. Do you do like an amusement park outing or a baseball park or something like that at the end of the summer, kind of as a thank you, team building type deal? The big thing for the tribes around here, and again, I'm in Oklahoma, a lot of times they will get a bus and take the summer youth like to Six Flags over Texas. As long as that is approved in advance in your award, you can do it. Can you, under OVC, take everybody out for dinner and a movie? Probably not. I mean, yes, if you can get prior written approval, but there would definitely be a lot of questions on that. Any other entertainment costs are not allowed. Fines, penalties, damages, other settlements. Fines, penalties, interest, and we talked about this yesterday when we were talking about credit cards, disallowed cost. If you incur a late fee or an interest charge on a credit card, you may not use grant money to pay that. Okay, questions on that? Again, the emphasis is grant money is specifically to be used to support the goals of the award. And if that is not what's happening, then pay for it with tribal money. Again, fundraising, investment management. If the fundraising cost is for the purpose of meeting a federal program objective, it can be allowable. Financial campaigns, endowment drive, solicitation, gifts, bequests, anything like that, not allowable. Questions? Goods or services for personal use. If part of the grant is to provide cost of housing, housing allowances, personal living expenses, those are allowable costs because they are a direct cost of the award. That's why you have the award, is to provide this. Anything else is no. Are employees eligible to participate in the grant? Can an employee be an eligible participant? Yeah, the answer is it depends on what your grant says. If they meet the eligibility requirements that you've established for the award, then yes. Otherwise, no. General cost of government. Portion of salaries and expenses directly attributable to managing and operating federal programs by the chief executive and his or her staff is allowable. Up to 50% of these costs can be included in the indirect cost calculation without documentation. Oh, but wouldn't someone other than themselves have to provide services to them? Yeah, if I am an employee, I cannot say that I'm eligible. So I would have to apply, and I should be able to apply, but I don't make the decision as to whether I'm accepted. I would be treated like any other applicant. And that's a good question. You can never authorize anything for yourself. I feel like I need to go back and look at that. So could I be a participant? Am I eligible to receive a benefit under this grant? Possibly, but can I determine that I am eligible? No, that has to be through our normal procedures. Does that make sense? If I am an employee of the program, can I apply for services? Yeah, there's no reason you can't apply, but there are going to be a lot of disclosures, and you obviously would have to do a conflict of interest notifications, and somebody other than you would do the admissions. It would definitely have to go up the chain of command.
Right. And if I can just add into that really quickly,
Sure.
because we work, in tribal communities, it's very small. Everybody knows everybody.
Yep.
And we all have family members that most likely go through traumatic experiences to where they're going to reach out and need services. So
Yes.
we have a policy is if we do know somebody, have close friends in common or family members that, definitely need services, we know of their situation, we actually will refer them to a different advocate and
Mhm.
step outside of that case. So we have really nothing to do with that case because it could be a conflict of interest and we're trying to protect ourselves.
Exactly.
Yes. And the same thing is if we did have a staff member come forward and they are, anything can happen that
Mhm.
is beyond their control. And so we can't discriminate against, our own employees. So
Mhm.
in that particular situation, it would be best to, based upon eligibility one, and then having somebody else outside, um, do the intake to see if they qualified for services and be treated exactly like a client. The one thing that I am looking forward on, or I am looking for some assistance on, is maybe finding some sort of policy from a different program that has maybe already have something like this in place when that happens. So if anybody out there has experienced this and has a policy already set in place that we can model and include when it pertains to employees, that would be helpful.
I can do it.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Because
I
there's,
have a few.
there's certain questions that had come up during that time, like, well,
Mhm.
if this, particular advocate experienced this, should they actually be seeing clients, seeing victims, doing the kind of groundwork when they are going through something their own selves. So that's kind of where we're kind of stuck right now. And we want something in place moving forward if that were to happen.
Right. And that's an interesting consideration. Should they even be involved?
Right. For example, there was, a situation where this particular couple was sober for, 20, 30 plus years. And that particular abuser fell off the wagon. And when that happens, becomes violent. So when that situation happened, it was like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, they've been in a healthy relationship, marriage for many years, but that thing came up and that occurred. So with that particular, employee, we had to really look at, okay, well, what does this mean for, as far as working with clients and in our
Mhm.
program. So that's kind of what we're looking for So I'm glad we're having the discussion. It's helpful.
Yeah, and it's a discussion that definitely needs to happen. My first thought is determining whether they should or should not be involved in client services. That's going to be an HR decision. So I don't think we can necessarily put a policy on HR as to what they should do. Now, as far as establishing immediate family and conflict of interest, that's an easy thing to do. But if you're questioning whether somebody should be performing these duties right now, I think that's an HR discussion, because there are way too many legal questions for me to really want to give you a definite opinion, because I'm not an attorney. I'm just the number person.
Right. Yeah. But I guess I'm kind of just, everything got situated, but I guess I'm just inquiring on if there are any other programs out there that may have experienced something similar and they have something already adopted in
Mhm.
place. I don't necessarily know if it would be, well, in our particular organization up to HR, it'd be definitely a matter that we'd have to work with them on,
Mhm.
being that they don't really understand, sometimes they may have an understanding of the situation, but they may not as well.
Right.
But yeah, if anybody has any policies already put in place, and or if you hear something like this in the future, please, yeah, reach out, because I think it would be helpful for all of us to be on board with that.
I think that you're right. And yeah, if anybody has any suggestions, if you've dealt with this, how did you handle it? There's a feature in chat where you can do a direct message and you don't have to put your business out to everybody. Yeah, and I think that's good. I'm trying to think, and I don't know the answer to this, but would anybody object to a participant list with contact information after this training? If you would not want to be included, message Joey. We are not going to frown on you or judge you in any way. It is entirely up to you. But I think it might be helpful for everybody to have. That's the one thing that's so hard about doing, an online training versus an in-person training, that you don't have the opportunity to talk to each other on breaks and exchange contact information and things like that. So if you're willing, we're going to assume that you are, and if you are not, please feel free to ask Joey to exclude you from that info. And again, we will not, it's entirely up to you. There's no judgment involved at all. We're not going to talk ugly about you if you don't want to be included, promise. I won't even know, so. Okay. Now that was a good question. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add in on that? Okay,
I have
general
a quick
cost.
question about
yes.
the overall training.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't want to take up all your training time.
You're fine.
I'm more of a person that loves to learn, directly, just like how you said. I'm sure many of us are. I'm so hands-on, and I feel like I receive the information more directly, because when we do Zooms and when we're doing it virtually, it's like, okay, I still have to work. I still have to get stuff done. So I'm so distracted. And so I'm trying to really pay attention to, everything that's really relevant and important to us. But with that being said, are you guys planning to have any in-person financial trainings that maybe some of our important administration people in the future, besides next month, might be able to join on, or is it just this month and next month?
Honestly, we're not that far yet because
Okay.
we still are not allowed to travel.
Okay, gotcha.
So
Okay.
once there is a travel ban is lifted, I'm sure that that's going to be discussed, but until that point, who the heck knows?
Gotcha. Okay,
I mean,
thank you so
yeah.
much.
Oh, you're welcome. Again, who would have thought that a year later we'd still be in the sick, but here we are. And at least we're able to get you all moving and get you some basic information. And again, you will have all of my contact information. It's the last slide in this. If you have not already received the PowerPoint, you will. And we'll
Perfect.
include any necessary regs as well.
Thank you.
You are welcome. Does anybody not have a copy of 2 CFR 200? Okay. We can, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be able to send that out. There's also the documentation from OVC on more specific examples of allowable and unallowable costs. Yeah, I don't have any problem sending it. We can either do a mass mail, or if you don't get it, shoot me an email and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, I can attach that to the email that I send out afterwards as well.
See, Joey's on it.
Christine, can you just send me, you said 2 CFR 200, but can you send me the other doc you mentioned?
Yes.
All right, great, thanks.
You are very welcome. Thought I'd already sent it to you, but I could be wrong. I've sent a lot of things to a lot of people, so who knows? Yeah, we'll make sure you get it. Okay, any other questions on goods and services for personal use before we move away from it? Yeah, I feel like I want to just say again, we are here to help you, period. So any information that you feel like you need and that would be helpful to you, please reach out. I am always happy to send anything I know. And I'm quite certain that anybody that you're working with in this program is also glad to. So don't hesitate. We really are here to help. Again, with general cost of government, what most people do is a 50% charge to indirect, which makes sense for people like your tribal administrator, council, those people who are working on federal and tribal activities. That's the standard. This one is interesting. Okay, materials and supplies, including costs of computing devices. These things, first off, can now be just expensed if it is less than $5,000. You no longer have to tag and track. And if you were here yesterday for the fixed asset training, you know why that's a benefit. The other big change is that any device, which would include cell phones, that are essential and allocable to the performance of the federal award, you don't have to prove that it is solely dedicated. If your kid calls you on your work phone to ask a question because you're not answering your personal phone, it's okay. And think about that, because if you're using a smartphone, it counts as a computing device. I use my phone for Google probably more than anything. Do you need a phone to do your job? I mean, I can almost guarantee the answer to that is yes. Do you need a specific dedicated work phone? That's up to you. If you are going to be on call at all hours, yeah, you may. You can use your personal phone and allocate. Yeah, I won't carry two phones. That's the nice thing about my job is I only have to carry the one. But a lot of it's going to come down to, do you want people to have your personal cell number? If you're okay with that and you don't care if they're calling at all hours of the night, you can do an allocation. A lot of people, frankly, don't want their information out there, and I totally respect that as well. In which case you want to use a dedicated work phone. You can, but you better make sure you track everything. And again, essential and allocable, as long as you can allocate. And think about it, can you do a realistic allocation? Do you have a call log where you can show specifically 10% of your personal cell phone was used for work business? Yeah, see, it is difficult. Go back to when we had talked about earlier about allocation. Is it going to put more time and energy into doing that allocation than the benefit? And if that's so, then probably you don't want to do it. It's just going to be a hassle for you. Okay, questions on costs of computing devices. I'm going to throw in a couple of side notes here. How many of you have issued a laptop for work use? This is kind of bonus training. Okay, you will. What are things that need to be considered? You should not be able to download anything. Any software, any applications should be downloaded by your IT person, your tribe, whoever is handling the IT portion of that. Why? Who owns the computer? Tribe. If you download Office, if you've got a bootleg copy of Office and you download it onto your work computer, who will be penalized for there being no license? The tribe. Malware, yeah, you could spread it all through the tribe. This is key. If you do this, make sure that anybody who is getting a tribally owned computer issued to them has to bring it in on a regular basis for IT to check and make sure that everything on there is licensed and approved. This really does, it has the potential to become a very big deal. So just be aware of it. You do not want to be the reason your tribe's IT is being held hostage, okay? Any questions on computing devices? Participant support costs. Right here, the majority of what you're doing. Direct costs for items such as stipends or subsistence allowances, travel allowances, fees paid to or on behalf of participants or trainees, but not employees in connection with conferences or training projects. Can you pay direct costs? Stipends, subsistence, travel, anything like that for conferences or training projects for your participants? Can you? Yes. As long as you can show why it is essential for the grant. Direct participant costs are the majority of your award. Think about what you have, and not just knowing the grants that are being offered here. You know, you have people who are giving gift cards for gas. You have people who are providing shelter. All of these things. Are those direct costs? Yes. Are they direct grant costs? Yes. That's what you've set up your program to do. Document, 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 particularly gas, food, clothing, hotel. Make darn sure that you can show adequate supporting documentation as to why this is necessary and reasonable as part of your award. Does that make sense to you? What kind of documentation do you think you need to include? Receipts? Good. Something to show that they're an eligible participant as well. I don't care if you use a code number or how you do it. Yeah. Registrations, all of that. Anything that shows this is an eligible person, however you have chosen to address the protected personally identifiable information, and documentation that this was done in accordance with your policies, procedures, and the grant. Do you have to use a number for your participants? And the answer is no. It depends a lot on how the information will, I mean, who's going to have access, basically. The only people who have access to names are in your office. You can still do that. If you are setting up a charge account, like with a local convenience store, first off, yes, you can do that, but you probably would want to use numbers because you don't have control over who might see that list. Does that make sense? just think about as you're setting these things up, who could potentially use this information? Recruiting costs. How many of you have recruited employees? How many of you have been recruited employees? It is allowable to use recruiting costs. Cost of employment agencies, all of that, relocation costs, all allowable. However, if I use grant money to relocate you to work on our program and you quit in the first year, we have to pay that money back. We being the tribe. Can the tribe collect from that employee? If they have it in their agreement, yes. Questions on that? Again, relocation is allowable. It is an allowable cost. As long as the move is for the benefit of the employer, the reimbursement is in accordance with established written policy. The reimbursement doesn't exceed the employee's actual or reasonably expected expenses. Can I charge the grant to have somebody come and pack up my house? Depends. Can I stand over them as they're packing and tell them to use more tissue paper or whatever? No. Relocation for current employees are subject to limits. Cost of transportation of household and personal effects. Cost of finding a new home up to a maximum period of 30 calendar days. Closing costs on the employee's former home. Yeah, I can charge to the grant my closing costs on the house that I'm selling up to 8% of the sales price. Okay. Questions on that before we get into travel? Because people seem to have questions on travel. Because at some point we will be traveling again. So, can I fly first class and charge it to the grant?
I think it needs to be justified. So if there was a situation that had occurred, maybe it's cheaper at that point during, when you're booking your flight, or, if a situation comes up and that's the only flight that was left, it has to be justified.
You are correct. I can. If there is a reason that I need it for medical reasons. I travel with, let's say I travel with a service dog, not a comfort support animal, but a licensed service animal, I can charge whatever costs are involved for my licensed service animal as well. In addition, if it is going to cost, let's say it's $100 more for me to have a direct flight than it is for me to have a flight that is going to have 4 connections and will have me flying all over the country for 12 hours as opposed to a direct flight of 3 hours. Can I pay for the more expensive flight with grant money? Sure can. We want to be good stewards of government funds, but that doesn't mean that we are going to make our employees take the red eye every time because that's cheaper. We're also not going to prolong travel. If you stay another day, it's going to save us money. It'll say we can get a cheaper flight. We can save $100 if you stay another day. Well, that's awesome, but who's paying for the hotel and per diem for that extra day? And hint, it's not the employee. So that's excessively prolonging travel and resulting in additional costs that would offset the transportation savings. Had a client who was on travel status. She was the CFO at her tribe in San Francisco at a conference. It was raining like it does in San Francisco. The hotel had marble floors. She walked in, she fell, she broke her leg. Did they put her in coach to come home with a broken leg and multiple connections? No, they did not. They flew her home first class and had justification. She was broken. For her to be able to sit in a coach seat for 4 hours was not reasonable under the circumstances. This is why documentation is so important, because as an auditor, if I pulled something that said they were, in first class, meals provided, that's a red flag for me if that's the only information I have. Questions on that? There's an executive, or there used to be, I don't know if he's still working or not, but there was an executive director who was 6'6". Do you think they put him in coach? He didn't fit. I mean, he literally did not fit. Got a doctor's note to justify putting him in business class, and that was fine. Okay, here's the documentation again. Pretty much the exact same documentation list we talked about earlier. Is it reasonable? Is it necessary? Is it allowable and allocable? Is there a clear purpose that shows that this is not for personal use? Is it included in our budget? Do we have the funding? Has it been coded? correctly? Did we have the purchase order check request properly approved? Is there a conflict of interest that needs to be disclosed? Is this allowable under the cost principles? Is this a last minute rush? Or have we followed policy and allowed reasonable time to address this? If it is a rush, have we documented appropriately why there was an emergency need? Am I comfortable with it? Do I feel like this makes sense and is reasonable and I would be okay for my name to be associated with this purchase? Any questions? Any comments, anything? Okay, I'm gonna stop this share. And I'm going to pull a different share. As long as we're talking allowable costs, let's talk about OVC examples of allowable and unallowable costs. And this is just a more specific version of everything we've already talked about. The main thing you need to look at as you're thinking about this, right here, when considering whether costs are allowable, is this cost related to supporting or assisting crime victims? How does this expense, how is making this expenditure going to assist our participants? If you can't answer that, then don't do it. Okay, so here are the general costs, and we're going to send you this, okay? Cost categories generally unallowable include activities or services not victim service related, not directed at assisting victims or improving victim services, costs incurred outside the project period, activities focused on crime prevention, not an allowable cost. Why not? Because we're working to assist crime victims. That's what we're doing here. Criminal justice activities that are not victim services. Here we go. Food, beverages, meals, refreshments at meetings, conferences, or trainings. This is not saying you cannot provide these items as emergency support for a crime victim. It is saying we're not, handing out snacks. Lobbying, no, never. Fundraising, nope. We already talked about that. Legal services for criminal defense. We already talked about that. Research. Nope. Audit costs that are not required under 2 CFR 200. Entertainment, including social, diversion, and amusement activities, not allowed. Purchasing real property, not allowed. Any questions on these before we go to the next one? Cannot supplant funding. This is to enhance or expand services to victims, not substitute existing funding sources. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? The whole point is when you get this grant, it's to add services that are not already being provided elsewhere. Okay. Again, here's the time tracking. I'm not even sure there's anything that's left to discuss on this one. I'll go slowly in case you want to stop and take another look. Again, incentive is allowed, COLA is allowed, salary compensation allowed. These are the positions. We know we have to track. All of these in the white are allowed. All of these fringe benefits are allowed. Your standard, workers' comp, unemployment, health insurance, FICA, retirement, support program, life insurance, leave time, all of that standard, allowable. When would this not be allowable? And that would be if you don't have anything at all in your policy, or you're providing different benefits for people who work in programs as opposed to people who work for the tribe. Cannot do that. Everybody gets the same treatments. Okay, for travel, mileage reimbursement. If you're using your own vehicle to do project-related activity. I mean, again, the travel's pretty standard. If you have to pay it to get there, it's going to be an allowable cost. Probably don't have much there right now, because nobody does. So what kind of equipment can you buy? How many of you have in your budget a vehicle? Yeah, a lot of people do. A lot of people are buying vehicles or buying trailers to provide services. Does anybody want to ask questions about that type of thing? GSA rates, absolutely, yeah. I mean, you could go with a lower rate, but I don't think you can do a higher rate. I think you're capped at GSA. You can use a snowmobile transport or a seaplane or a hovercraft. These are all allowable. I always get into reading these regs. People laugh at me. But did you ever think you would be able to say, oh yeah, we could do a hovercraft for that? It says so right here. The likelihood is going to be pretty low, but you know, in theory. Can you use tiny homes? Depends on what you're going to do. You use the state rate. Why are you using the state rate and not the federal? Do you know? I mean, it's a federal grant, so automatically, I think you would need to use the federal. Which one's higher?
So Christine, this is what is a kind of an issue because we don't have a travel policy. So what the tribe has done here is included a little blurb in the personnel policy that states you get $66 total for out of state, 66 for the day out of state, and then 41 in state. But they've built this little blurb into the personnel policy that says that. So I can understand using those rates if you were a state funded program and that's where your funds were coming from. I can understand using those rates. But I don't even know if they match the state anymore because they're so old. But
yeah, that's not.
Yeah, and then at the same, but if we're federally funded, you would think that we should be able to use the federal rates for travel. And but we're told that the personnel policy it basically supersedes the GSA rates because that's what the tribe's policy is. So,
no, because again, the reason that you get reimbursement is so that the employee is not burdened by a required travel.
right, because we do end up paying. We end up paying to go. We end up,
You're paying to go to work.
Yeah. So
no, that's not how it works.
Okay.
Yeah.
No. So it would be good if we could get a travel policy specifically set up because that it's hard to get through. Like if we don't put these rates that are approved by the personnel policy into our travels, they're not going to get approved because the personnel policy says that, and that's what we are to go by. So.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have something different in your financial management policy? Okay, my child has locked himself out. Please hold while I let him in. God. Charlotte, start explaining the tiny home and what you want to do with that, because that'll give you a few minutes to type. Okay, now it won't let me come back. There I am. Okay, sorry about that. Used as a shelter for participants which are movable for security reasons. I don't see why you wouldn't be able to, because that would, let me think about that. Let's keep that in the back of our mind as we're going through the rest. My original thought is yes. And if anybody wants to disagree with me, you can. Let's talk it through. But I know similar things have been purchased with some others, so I would say yes. There would definitely be a significant documentation involved, but you know, that's not that big a deal. Because you're providing victim services, right? Yeah, I'm saying yes, unless we see something in here that tells me otherwise. I'm looking over here at the disallowed. I don't see it there for sure. Yeah, I think we're good. Shelter supplies are allowable. You know, dishes, small appliances, that type of thing. The basic things that you need in a unit would be allowable costs. You know, you'll need bedding, you'll need cribs, you may need sleeping bags, towels for sure. Stove, refrigerator, maybe washer dryer, maybe not, depending on what you have in the area. Basic cleaning supplies, sure. Yeah, coffee pots. I mean, thank you, but I want a coffee pot, and it's perfectly reasonable for me to be able to expect that. What you can't do, again, are buy things that are not related to providing victim services. Hats, mugs definitely are not related to providing victim services. Office supplies, fine. Therapeutic supplies for the kids, if that's what you're doing in your program, absolutely. Supplies for participation in cultural and other traditional activities, yes. Basic furnishings, yeah. Cabinets, locks. Any questions on these? This is, again, I feel like this is pretty much common sense. What is not allowed is construction, okay? Construction is an unallowable cost except for relatively minor renovation, remodeling, maintenance, repair, and site prep for installation of mobile modular buildings. Talk about that. Is anybody doing that? Does anybody have any kind of remodel renovation in their budget that they need to discuss? You're going to need a wall. Can you build a wall? Everybody else who's in here, what do you think? Lily says yes. Why is Lily saying yes? Because they've already talked to me about it and I know that it's a yes. It meets the standard. Yeah, it meets the standard. The reason for this wall is for security and privacy. That is minor. It's, yeah, it's an allowable because it increases the safety and security of participants. Heating and cooling system, that can go either way. And I will tell you now, if you want to do that, you need to have really good justification. And it will need to go up the chain here to show whether this is a relatively minor renovation, remodeling, maintenance, and repair. So Sherry, the correct answer for you right now is it depends. Yeah, sorry, I can't give you a better answer than that, but unfortunately, it depends on a lot of different circumstances and the whys and how much and all of that good stuff. So maybe. Anybody else have a question on that? What about if you are making a building handicap accessible? Can you do that with grant funds? Lily says yes. What do you think? Can you do it? ADA, yeah, you can. And again, if all you are doing is making the building accessible for all participants, then that should be a relatively minor renovation, remodel, maintenance, repair, yes. Leasing a building that program responsible for half, I'm assuming for half of the maintenance cost, is that allowable? Possibly. Again, that's another one where we need a little more information. What's the purpose of the building? Don't look too closely. I'm gonna make you dizzy as we flip back through these pages. Here's where the first two questions are. How is leasing this building related to supporting or assisting crime victims? It's providing a place for the staff who provide the assistance to go. So yeah, should be. Assuming that it meets all of these other requirements. Can you pay half of the maintenance? Do you take half of the space? And I'm assuming half, and you could mean $500 a month maintenance costs flat rate. Charlotte, do you want to like unmute and discuss this? If not, I'm not going to make you. We can do this through chat. You're responsible for $500 cost of anything over. I would want to see a lot more information before I say that's allowable. And again, I'm going to look at, is it reasonable and is it necessary? Because if the answer to either of those is no, then no, we can't do that. Why is this coming on you? Who else has the building? There's a lot of questions I'd want to ask before I'd say definitely yes or no. Yeah, that one's, it's not nice and clear cut, which, you know, is not surprising. If it's something that we have a question about, it's probably not nice and clear cut. And that's just how it goes. All right, I am going to tell you on procurement. First, you need to have a procurement policy. If you have not gone through procurement training, you need to talk to your grant person, because you probably need to do that if you have any significant procurement in your budget. Hey, look, here's cell phone service. Allowable costs. As long as it's to maintain communications with victims when they are out in the field and or support the operation of crisis hotline through cell phone rotation. That goes back to, are we going to have a department phone that gets passed around? And the answer is probably yes. Maintenance of shelters, transitional housing units, allowable. Minor renovation, repair, maintenance, all of that. Here's where it gets challenging, and this is why we have to ask so many questions. What is minor? That's where we go back again on the HVAC unit. Is that going to be minor? And the answer is, I don't know, because I don't have enough information yet. That makes sense? Consultant services, trauma-informed care, that's the big one. Tribe code development. Sorry, cat's going crazy now. I did not expect a tail upside the head, sorry. Tribal code development. If you are working on improving, updating your tribal codes, yes, allowable. Trauma-informed care, cultural experts. Again, we are all about providing culturally appropriate care. So yeah, anything that's going to help you do that is going to be allowable. Costs associated with treating injuries that a victim sustained as a direct result of crime that is not otherwise covered by health insurance, crime victim compensation, or other forms of reimbursement may be allowed. Okay, let's get into, does anybody have questions on that? Those were all procurement contract services. I do want to get into the other section here. Who teaches procurement training? You need to register. Well, I'll give you 3 guesses. There is actually a procurement training. There were 2 done, one for vehicle purchases and one for contract services, and they are both available on demand, I believe, aren't they, Joey? Joey may not have that answer off the top of his head, but I believe that those were recorded and are available for use. If you will shoot me an email, I will double check. And I honestly don't know if there are going to be additional ones.
Sorry, what was the
Offered.
question, Christine?
The procurement training on vehicle procurement and contract services, are those on demand recorded?
Recorded, no.
They were not?
They're not recorded and made for the public. That's for HUD's use.
No, for this program.
I'm
I
not
think
quite
there
sure.
were, because Robin and I were talking about that earlier. I can find out about that. Let me do some digging and get back. Yeah, there's recorded webinars, and I believe that was one of them. Matt knows things. There you go. Housed in the online reporting site and on the tribalvictimservices.org. Yes. Thank you all. I was pretty sure that they were out there, but I'm never 100% certain. And again, for everyone, if you have procurement specific questions, you're going out to buy a vehicle, what do you need to do? I know we've got the documentation, the paperwork is set up and available. And if you've got questions on it, you can always reach out. Okay, so let's talk other. Emergency or short-term victim needs. Food, gasoline, groceries, clothing, personal hygiene products, supplies, toiletries, household supplies. You have to have that in your narrative. You have to have a documentation as to how you are going to do this. This is one of those where documentation is super important to show that this was not employee personal use, okay? That this is an eligible participant receiving necessary, reasonable assistance. How many of you have that in your budget?
Can you repeat what you're asking? What is in our budget?
Do you have something in your budget where you are providing food, gas, groceries, anything like that
Oh, okay.
on
Yes.
a short-term emergency basis? There's
Yes,
a
we
lot
do.
of, there's so many different programs and how things are being done that not everybody is doing this. What about rental assistance? That is going to be, if it is allowed, usually for rental assistance, you'll need to coordinate. Do you have a housing department or a housing authority? And I'm asking because a lot of times your housing department or housing authority has emergency housing assistance funded. So the challenge with so much of this is coordinating with the rest of the tribe to see which department is best to assist this person. We've got you for overnight. You ran in the middle of the night with your kids. We've got you for the next, night, 2 nights, whatever. But how do we move forward in assisting you once the immediate short-term need is addressed? These are your people. These are your tribal members. You've got
For
to
us-
figure out a way to everybody coordinate. Yes.
For our program, we're a tribal consortium, so we service, pretty much our whole state of Nevada and the tribal community. So we
Mhm.
determine that based upon the client's needs, and the client's needs are usually assessed during the intake process because not all of them and not everyone lives on tribal land.
Right. Yeah, and depending on how the assistance works, they may not have to work on tribal land or live on tribal land. Depends on your
And
service
everything
area.
everything that we basically put in our grant would
There you go.
match the budget narrative with those costs, detailing and explaining how that would work and why.
Okay, and that makes sense. Yeah, it's just a matter of, we know we can do these particular services with this grant. What other services are available throughout the tribe for our, now as we're looking at next steps? Your housing is long-term with a waiting list, and your participants' needs are now, absolutely, and housing can't help. We're having cat attack here. I'm going to need to see, well, first off, what was in your budget as far as providing housing? Normally, that's going to be pretty tightly restricted on this grant, because there are other options. I'm trying to think, and I know there's some new emergency assistance funding that's coming into play with housing. Yeah, depending on what you've put in your grant, it's a maybe. Looking to see if it's saying anything here that knows, and the answer is not yet. Lodging is, yeah, that's allowable. Transportation assistance, yes. Short-term care, yes. Housing assistance, there you go. Rental assistance, not limited to security deposits, utility assistance, home furnishings, and other costs incidental to relocation to transitional or permanent housing as needed. Yeah, if it's in your grant, if it's in your budget, it's an allowable cost. In-home care supervision. Short-term nursing home, convalescent care, child care. All of these things that are going to basically help the participant get out and stay out of a bad situation. Here's where we're talking about again. How can we layer our funding? As in, what other programs do we already have within the tribe that can provide some of this assistance? Let's say you've got a victim with children who has left an abusive situation. Is there general assistance? Can they apply for general tribal assistance? Yeah, that's something that will help them out in the longer term. You're the right now, what do we do? But you've got to look and see what are the next steps and what can we do as a tribe. Does that make sense? in an abuse situation, it's going to take the tribe. It's going to take everybody to help break this cycle and keep this family out of that situation. You're there to meet the emergency needs, but 6 months from now, how are they going to be able to move forward? Okay, facility costs, of course, are allowable. Reasonably apportioned if they also support non-grant activities. You cannot double dip and have them direct and indirect for the same spot. Basic operating costs, of course, are allowable. Insurance, indirect. That's a lot of information. Does anybody have any questions? Or are you just kind of like catching your breath here for a minute? It's a lot. And remember, we just kind of hit the high points too. There's a lot of information that you need to know. And it takes time and experience to get to that point, and you've got to know where to look. So what we are going to send you are copies of 2 CFR 200. Remember, subpart D and subpart E are really the only ones that you need to focus on right now. We are going to send you this VOCA allowable, non-allowable costs, so that as you're setting things up, this kind of helps you think it through. And we're going to send you the PowerPoint. So, questions, anything? Is there anything else you need sent? What do you think?
I just had a question, not necessarily for this. Well, it is related, but thank you for all the information and all the copies that we're going to get. It's definitely useful, helpful reminders, a lot of great information shared. But can you possibly share or include any unique programmatic activities that people are using with these funds? So maybe something, that are outside of the box that like, wow, that tribe's really doing great with these, this program, or just like unique projects that you can share.
Many different ways to address this. Matt, is there anything you'd want to add to this? I kind of hesitate to put other tribes' information out there without their approval.
I'm not necessarily identifying the tribes, but just mainly the projects.
There's quite a bit of culturally based therapy and different related methods that are showing some pretty effective results. They're showing really good results. That sense of community, the sense of belonging, that's huge. Because as you know, victims lose that. That's part of how they become victims, as they get cut off from that. So in some ways, that's really helpful to integrate them back into the community and help them understand that they matter. Yeah, TLPI is providing a lot of program TA. And they've
Okay.
probably got some really good examples.
Awesome. Thank you.
Sure, I just see what gets put into place and figure out how they're going to pay for it. What other questions have y'all got? Joey, are there next steps here? Or do we just let them run wild?
No next steps from me. I will get that information and the part list out to you guys probably on Monday.
Okay. All right. I'm going to be around for a few minutes if anybody has additional questions. And again, thank you all so much for giving me your time on this. I appreciate it. Hopefully you're feeling a little more comfortable with this now.